Hello, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're very privileged to be joined by a good friend, Professor Timothy Lynch, who's joining us from outside of Melbourne, Australia. So it's Wednesday morning, it's a summer morning in Australia. And let me just tell you a little bit about Tim, and then we will jump into what I'm sure will be a great conversation. Tim grew up in the UK, has studied both undergrad and some grad work in the UK, has a master's from the University of London, has a doctorate from Boston College, which he attended as a Fulbright scholar, has written prolifically on American foreign policy, which is his expertise. He's taught in Australia, the US, Europe, China, writes lots of articles, penetrating, interesting, provocative articles, and is really a delightful gentleman. So Professor Lynch, Tim, good to see you again.
Well, John, I'm delighted to be here, and great to be able to speak to the good people of Illinois, and I'm excited to have a debate with you. I know how key you are to my understanding of many of the issues. I'm a great fan of your book, which you gave me in 2014. And you followed up with some really terrific work, particularly the work on the transition, the JFK Ike transition, which is very timely at the moment. Perhaps we might get onto that. But I am delighted to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Great. And I might just say, Tim kind of picked up on it. My wife and I were in Australia in 2014, and I was doing some book talks, and also we were just having fun, which Australia is a great place to have fun. We spent some time in Melbourne. I looked up Tim. He was an utterly delightful host, gave us a great tour of the University of Melbourne, took us to the faculty lounge. We had a nice cup of coffee and chatted for a long time, and saw we had a lot of really some interests in common. So it's good to see him again virtually, and hope to get him here sometime, and I'd love to visit him again in Melbourne. So, but Tim, give us just a little bit of sense of your background. I knew you grew up in the UK. Were you always a kind of a political junkie? I mean, you're obviously, deeply expert in political science and history. So tell us a little bit about your intellectual journey.
Well, I think I reached the age of 18 thinking I would be a historian. And what I realized is that I'd run out of European history. I got up to 1945, and suddenly all the power dissipates. And I've always contended that my intellectual connection, the intrigue, has always been about trying to understand power. And because Europe had exhausted its, I moved naturally towards the US, which had the power. So that led me in my undergraduate and postgraduate career to a study of the United States, which I've been studying as all my adult life. That my father's a historian. I think it's part of the family business, but it was suggested to me I make the leap to political science, really for reasons of getting entry to Boston College, because I had an advisor in London that was well connected there, and suggested some of my interests and his leverage would be greater if I did a PhD in poli-sci, which I did at BC in the late 1990s, and that really transformed me. I think from a scholar that understood the US from a critical perspective in the UK to someone that lived in the US, studied with some top political scientists. I did some work for C-SPAN, which I know is something we share in common, you and I, and that really changed my approach, and I think made me hopefully a better scholar. So that's the trajectory I took. I've always been fascinated by studying the US from a critical perspective. One of my great heroes is Alexis de Tocqueville, and of course he wrote the greatest book ever written about the United States by a foreign observer, until my next one. And it's always, Australia appealed to me as a kind of comparative case with a common point of origin. I mean, not identical, but a common point of origin, and a good base from which to study the United States. So that's how I've ended up here, but still with my central focus on the US, and particularly on how the US engages with the world.
Well, I've seen some of the talks on YouTube, and you sometimes playfully start out by saying, I'm Tim Lynch, I'm a political scientist, but don't hold this against me. But you also talk about just perhaps the trap that political scientists sometimes fall into, which is having very elaborate theoretical structures, but not much of a historical base to them. So it seems at times to be a kind of arcane language that they're speaking to each other. So talk about how the importance of just grounding your political science in history, how important that's been to you.
John, I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the weaknesses of political science is that it's insufficiently anchored in historical grasp, and too often the interposition of a theory is done to cover this gap in historical knowledge. Theories are very reassuring because it means you've got a way of sifting and avoiding a lot of the complexities that history throws up. Done well, of course, political science, and I'm not going to claim I'm part of this group I'll describe, but a good political scientist knows his or her history. I think a good political scientist has to be at some level a political historian, and political science doesn't just appear. Understanding trends and patterns, indeed, the claim that you can scientifically understand politics requires, to me, absolutely and fundamentally a grasp of history, which is why I'm always struck by the constant regression in the focus of analysis. I think political scientists have just about reached the progressive era, and they will eventually go backwards more and more, which I welcome, because they need more source material, and that source material is in the historical record much more than it's in modern theoretical designs. So I'm a skeptical political scientist, but I think working within a discipline for so long should give you a healthy skepticism about what makes it work and what makes it doesn't. And I'm keen. I remember when I moved into political science at Boston College, I was in awe of the rigor and the prestige. And I think an important, healthy development is for that to lessen, to realize that political science is a set of tools rather than some magic way of understanding the way the world works. It's a highly imperfect science, but gives you sufficient tools, I think, to make some very important claims.
Well, Tim, before we dive in too deeply, I want to give you a chance to tell your story about working for C-SPAN and developing some acting skills, as I remember. Tell that story.
Well, when I was a graduate student in Boston, I got a gig playing a Tocqueville interpreter, which meant I was it. I played this great Frenchman in a recreation of his journey from 1829, a 9-month journey as a 25-year-old. I was 25. I come originally from a country which is quite close to France, and that seemed to persuade the audience that I was put in front of that I was in some way an accurate representation of the great man. And I think in those 9 months, I certainly learned about Democracy in America, his great 2-volume book, but I also learned a lot, I think, about civil associations in the United States, local governments, schools, in a way that engagement through texts and lectures just wouldn't have given me. And that came through C-SPAN, which I still am an addict of. I welcome this notion of an unfiltered window on American politics, and I was delighted for a small time to be part of it. I think it taught me how to lecture. I mean, I was thrown in front of some very, very diverse and eclectic audiences, and I had to, in a 20-minute speech, get across why Alexis de Tocqueville was important, and it's still given me some pedagogical tricks which I still use now. So God bless C-SPAN.
All right. Well, Tim, before we get into the US, I wanted to ask you just a question or two about Australia. I know you've been in Melbourne, I think, for a decade. And, I mean, I have a deep affection for Australia. And unfortunately, it seems like most of the time we read about Australia in the United States, something bad is happening. But tell us a little bit about how the Australians have dealt with COVID. How my impression is better than most, maybe not quite as good as New Zealand, but pretty darn well. Describe what's going on there.
Yes, there's a good deal of posturing. I think I'll call it posturing by our state leaders, particularly our state leaders, the equivalent of US state governors, about how well we've avoided the mass infection and deaths, which of course swept nations like the US. And I feel like we give them some credit. This is a very live political issue here over who takes credit. My sense is that we are a big empty island. If you took it to the New Zealand case, they're a small empty island, so that our capacity to raise border restrictions and stop people coming in and getting out, and indeed crossing state boundaries within the states, is a much more manageable proposition than has proved to be the case in Europe and in North America, where there are a lot of people and a lot of political jurisdictions who all have to coordinate and often don't. And that's facilitated the spread of COVID in a way that Australia's been able to avoid. So it's great blessing living in Australia is its distance, and it's also its greatest curse. We call this the tyranny of distance. Everything in Australia eventually comes down to the fact that we are distant even from our nearest neighbours, whereas Europe and America don't have this as an issue, and they don't also have some of the benefits. But I do think, and we could go on all day about this, John, I do think it's highlighted some of the key differences between American federalism and Australian federalism. They're both, of course, different in that one's a Westminster-based system, and the other is the Washington presidential congressional system. But they're comparable in a way I hadn't really anticipated in terms of how their federalism works. And what COVID highlighted was just how crucial and how rogue or independent some of the state governments could become in the face of this threat, which in some ways is mirrored by the varying approaches that governors and their states have taken in the face of COVID. So there's a lot that we are both continental nations that have federal systems, although we are much smaller in scale. But there's a lot that they have in common, I think. Very good doctoral thesis in comparing the COVID response through the different mechanisms of federalism that both states have.
Tim, I guess the other issue that I remember, it was about this time last year where there were just some horrific fires in Australia. And I think Victoria was hit really hard. I haven't heard that this year, and I just wasn't sure if the attention had largely shifted to COVID. Has the fire season been a little less devastating this year? And I guess maybe if you could just briefly talk about just the whole climate change issue, because a lot of the reportage coming out of last year is okay, this is the future world, and you better step up and do something, because if not, this is what we have coming down the road.
Yes, it's hard to imagine it being worse than it was compared to last Christmas, the Christmas 1920, when they were unprecedented in their ferocity. I think the whole COVID year has made us forget all that. Australians live with climate as a kind of ever-present reality. I mean, it's something that you can speak to your experience and see if it computes. But my first response to the place is it's so empty, and the people that do exist highly conscious of issues like climate and dry seasons, drought. And fires become they become part of the one's psychological disposition in a way that I never felt was the case when I lived in the US or in the UK. We're highly urbanized as a culture, as a society. 90% of Australians live in one of the 5 cities. And the bush, the outback, has this kind of mythical quality, which kind of hangs over everything that goes on. And it can't be populated. And there's no frontier in the Australian experience in the way that there was in the US, simply because the land's not arable. It's far too saline. And there aren't great rivers. There's no Missouri or Mississippi that America has. So climate, and of course climate change, are debates here which have far greater salience, and I would argue far greater ideological contestation over them than you get even in the United States. We've got 2 large parties, the Liberals and the Labour Party, and the Liberals have a broad climate change skepticism, in part because it's a recognition that Australia exists on the basis of selling coal, selling carbon resources to Asia, but to China particularly, and a Labour Party that's far more conditioned to respond to the concerns of metropolitan elites, which think we can get by through renewables and windmills. So it's a very live debate here, and one I don't think we're going to escape soon because of issues like the bushfire season last year.
Well, Tim, let's turn to the U.S. And I mean, you've written interestingly and provocatively and also comprehensively. I've just seen you give a talk on your Oxford Encyclopedia of American Military and Diplomatic History, which is like a 1,400 2-volume set. Tell us a little bit about that initiative, and then we'll move to your most recent book pertaining to In the Shadow of the Cold War. But tell us about the encyclopedia, the genesis of it, and good grief, how do you assemble, that kind of work?
Well, I wouldn't do it again. I think every scholar at some point should take on a reference work, not for 2 reasons. One, it gives you a far fuller grasp of the area in which you're working, and many of the subfields that you're not acquainted with. I mean, I can claim to have not just read, but to have edited across 2 very large volumes. So, and the great thing that comes from that, John, is this reputation for the knowledge contained therein, which I'm very happy to trade on, but often gets exposed. And the second reason I think every scholar should take on a reference work is because it teaches you how to deal with academics, pressured academics, big name academics that you've got to cajole into reaching a deadline, usually for quite low remuneration. So it taught me, I mean, sure, it gave me networks and connections, which I still use, but I think the more important lesson was to understand the psychology of colleagues around the world. I mean, every continent was represented in the across the 2 volumes. So it was a very important lesson in how to, we call it leadership here. We don't do administration if you're an academic, you do leadership. And it taught me how to lead a group of scholars. I was very ably supported by some associate editors that were crucial in their area and had many of the same challenges that I had in assembling academics. But it was an important lesson, but not one I would repeat willingly and for low pay.
Tim, let's talk about your most recent book, which I love. Agree with much of, disagree a little bit with, but still think is a wonderful, wonderful book. And it's called In the Shadow of the Cold War, American Foreign Policy from George Bush Sr. to Donald Trump. And in it, you chronicle effectively 5 of American foreign policy presidents. But let's talk maybe first about a couple of the big themes, which I think are really important. And the first one is just the continuity in American foreign policy, because particularly during presidential elections, it seems like we're often go through a cycle where we elect someone who is the temperamentally the opposite of his predecessors, from Obama to Trump, from Bush to Obama, et cetera. But one of your central arguments is that there's a fair amount of continuity in American foreign policy, despite a lot of the rhetoric which would suggest otherwise. Develop that thought.
Yes. I think, given the scale of the American government, and not least its foreign policy bureaucracy, it would be unusual to expect it to be able to change quickly. So before you interpose any history into it, if you just knew the structure of the system itself, I think your prediction would be that this is a very slow moving machine, which is not immune to revolution or to rupture, but it militates against revolutionary change. So once you've got that understanding, I think, of the mechanics, and the American system, I think, is highly susceptible to this kind of analysis, because it is a machine that would go of itself, a government of laws, not of men. Once you understand how it works and how it's supposed to work, the operating prediction, which is mostly borne out in my reading of US history and politics, is that change comes, but it comes extremely slowly, and when it comes on the basis of consensus rather than through gridlock. The system is much more prone to jamming up, to stopping, to gridlock, intentionally so, and that makes change really rather difficult. I mean, not to digress too much, it's always struck me that Marxists are uniquely disabled when it comes to understanding the American system, because there's no place to have a revolution in. There's no Winter Palace. There's no Bastille. As we saw earlier in the month when those weird men and women invaded Capitol Hill. Well, you could seize Capitol Hill, but that's just one of the three. It's a machine that it's very difficult to centralize power. I mean, deliberately so. This was the founders' great concern. So when you apply this mechanical understanding to its foreign policy, I think it makes you understand essential continuities, because continuities are a kind of obligation born of design. It doesn't mean change is impossible. It just means change is really rather difficult. And I think Trump, we could claim, complicates this, but I don't think he invalidates it. That his greatest challenge wasn't CNN or the woke left. His greatest challenge was the US Constitution and the machinery of government, which is extremely watchful of the kind of centralization of power that he aspired to, of course, aspired to it without any of the competencies necessary to pull it off. So even without leaping ahead to Trump quite yet, I think what you find is presidents, when they run for office, and you've written some masterly accounts of this, I'm thinking recently of the Ike Jfk transition, and I'll perhaps let you speak to that and see what you think. But that's one of those examples where you get what appears to be a black and white choice, or a transition from an old order and an old unwell man to this young dynamic man of the 1960s. But what you actually get in foreign policy terms, I think, is you move from a kind of, we need to do something about Vietnam, but we're not quite sure, to, yes, we need to do something about Vietnam, and I'm going to start it. And I think that essential continuity across that transition is something that's often missed. The other great one, I think, is also, although there are several, is Carter to Reagan. We think of Reagan as the kind of clear antidote to the failed Jimmy Carter. But I don't think you can understand the Reagan defense buildup without understanding the turn in Carter's foreign policy halfway through, when he starts to take the Soviet Union and global communism far more seriously, and begins that arms buildup, which Reagan then inherits and runs with. And I think those are a couple of examples, I think, where continuity of foreign policy imposes itself in a way that electoral politics often conceals.
I agree entirely. One point you also make in your book, Tim, is you're looking in this sort of 30-year period from the Cold War ending in 89 or 91. In fact, as you say, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a picnic, and you describe a wonderful picnic in Hungary that triggered some movements of people and so forth. But you call yourself sympathetically critical of the United States foreign policy, say from 91 to now. In some of the literature here, people are more critical. They say this has been, in 1991, the US was at the apex of the world, and it's been pretty much 30 years of misguided policy, ill-advised wars, squandered fiscal policy, just a pretty awful parade of policies that have driven the country down pretty significantly, where it is no longer, it's still the strongest power in the world, but China has gotten much, much closer in the last 30 years than it might have been anticipated. So play off this. I know it's hard to just talk about all the complexity, but do you think you seem to believe that the US managed this period in reasonably good form?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment of the argument I try and make in the book. Well, the great irony, of course, is that we're dealing with an incoming administration that rather likes to trade on the beneficence of the rule-bound international order of the last 30 years. And it seems to me you can't have it both ways. The last 30 years have either been a failure, have seen the rise of China, the defenestration of the American working class, the emboldenment of Russia, or they've been about the expansion of a global legal system with the United States at its apex. And I don't think the intellectuals of the Biden administration, who are all now jostling for position and advantage in the transition, have really resolved that contradiction. My claim would be, even before you factor in the decisions the United States have made over the last 30 years, they still by default enjoy several key advantages denied to their strategic competitors like China and an order of magnitude less Russia. And they are those advantages which America has had in its back pocket since its inception, certainly since its rise to globalism. Things like the fact that it speaks the global language, English. It's a system founded on property rights, which have never really lost their appeal, despite attempts by leftist regimes to alter that. It has an economy which, even in downturn, is the world's largest, and even allowing for the disruptions of the Trump era, although I think these predate him somewhat, it's got a social cohesion. Again, I would claim, we can have this argument, even allowing for current polarization, which is underestimated. The fact of American religiosity, unlike any other, Americans experience and profess faith in a way no other Western democracy does. This represents a considerable strength in how it navigates the world. It does it from a position of, I think, a far greater social cohesion than we often give it credit for. And these applied across the 30 years of the post-Cold War era. Now, sorry, it's a long answer, but you've asked a very, very good question. Clearly, there were errors within that period. But I think the great errors are sins of omission more than of commission. It's what America didn't do or did insufficiently, which created problems for it. And these began, I think, with the initial war in Iraq, where the father, rather kind of Greek tragic terms, hands on a problem to the son by refusing to resolve the problem and remove Saddam from power. I mean, lots of very good reasons why you wouldn't do that in 1991. But it stores up a problem that American politics refuses to deal with for over a decade, necessitating a second invasion in 2003, which again is premised on doing as little as possible, going in with a light footprint, this laser-like thrust into Mesopotamia, and then getting out on the cheapest terms possible. It wasn't an imperial project. I think one of its great weaknesses is that it didn't have sufficient imperial ambition underpinning it. It wasn't about restoring or creating an Iraqi democracy. It was about letting the chips fall where they may, and then quitting. Now, these are great, profound sins of omission, which created long-term, decades-long problems. Afghanistan, I think, is susceptible to the same analysis. So my reading is of the last 30 years is that if America had shown a greater resolve, this of course is a hypothetical, we can't know, but its track record of remaking important parts of the world is Europe and Japan, Germany and Japan. Now, I know these are highly imprecise analogies to apply to Arab Muslim politics, but they're about the only ones that America's got. And the lesson of those great reconstruction efforts was that you need troops on the ground, you need long-term dedication to the remaking of a foreign political system, and a certain social and political will at home to make this possible. And these were lacking in over the post-Cold War era for lots of different reasons. I think one of the key ones, of course, is that America had, perhaps perfectly appropriately, thought it had won, and all history then became a mopping up exercise, the gentle prodding and cajoling of nations to follow a democratic path. Now, cajolement and gentle persuasion is fine, but what America, I think, needed across that period, and this is not to sound like a nuts job militarist, what America needed across those decades was just a greater dedication to the task at hand, a willingness to use military force in defense of key political propositions. And that was lacking. Sorry, Joel, that's a very long answer.
No, that was a really interesting. Tim, let's talk about some specific presidents. And Barack Obama, you wrote a really, really wonderful review of President Obama's new memoir in the Australian Book Review, and I was chuckling as I was reading it, because you started out by saying it was the best memoir since Grant. And then you said, of all the extant presidential autobiographies, Obama's is by a distance the most engaging. Admittedly, the competition is not fierce. Calvin Coolidge penmanship is a cure for insomnia. And so you go. No, but the more sort of profound point you make about President Obama, which you think is reflected in his memoir, is that he was a reformer who was surprised that his people were not as committed to the project as he expected them to be. You write at one point, like so many progressive scholars, he is often disappointed by ordinary people who fail to live up to his expectations of them. Expand on that.
Yes, so Obama is a very interesting case because he invites, I think part of his great appeal, and I'd be very interested to get your sense of this, John. Part of his appeal is that he's able to be this empty vessel into which we all get to pour our preferred libation. So if you're a realist, there's some pretty good evidence, certainly in his rhetoric, and I'd point you towards his Nobel Prize speech, that this is a realist president whose first and last commitment is to the physical defense of his people. But if you're a liberal, if you're a progressive, there's a lot in his record and behaviors to suggest he actually did believe he was the cosmopolitan in chief and was leading this great revolution on behalf of a progressive, rules-bound world order. And he managed to claim both titles, to move not quite seamlessly, but move nevertheless between both interpretations of what he was, and to do so and come out relatively unscathed. I think the problem was, what's the record of achievement given this rather slippery self-identification? And I think the achievements are pretty thin. And of course, what you can't escape, and I tried to get that across in that review, and it computes with my reading of his very interesting, lengthy autobiography. You can't get away from the fact that he is replaced by his nemesis, by Donald Trump. There's something about Barack Obama which we must understand to try and understand why we got the Trump presidency. And he's not the best. He's not the best analyst of that question. What do you think, John? I'm fascinated.
Well,
your reaction.
I think this is a case where I think political science and history have maybe a lot to learn from each other. And I think it's really, this maybe sounds like a cop-out, I think it's too soon to tell on Obama. I mean, I think that if his successors, President Biden and others, for example, build on and dramatically expand the Affordable Care Act, I think that will be remembered as a major historical achievement. If the US comes back to Paris with a vengeance, I think that will look, better than it did when President Trump was walking out of Paris. If somehow, and this is a tough road, if somehow they can re-energize the Iranian nuclear deal. So, I mean, I think Obama had some reasonable successes, faced an extraordinarily tough Congress, and I was covering it for that whole time, and they were out frankly, to defeat him. That was largely Senator McConnell's agenda, was to block everything he did. So I think his successes were reasonably good. And I think if his successors build on them, history may treat him, more gently than you suspect. I mean, the one piece, you write this, and I think it's really interesting. You said, Obama never saw Trump coming. And I agree with that entirely. But then I would also say Mitch McConnell did not see Trump coming. Paul Ryan didn't see him coming. John McCain didn't see him coming. Mitt Romney didn't see him coming. Marco Rubio didn't. Ted Cruz didn't. Really, no one did. And here I think this is where it's interesting. Let's maybe even move to Trump. Had 70,000 votes been cast differently in 2016, the whole narrative would have shifted, which was, Hillary Clinton, wins election narrowly, Obama legacy intact, and then who knows how the 4 years would have ensued. So, I mean, I think that her defeat had a way of imperiling whatever legacy he, had hoped to develop. So before we move to Trump, would you like to respond to that? Or
I think that's brilliantly put, and I share much of it. And I suppose I'm just cool on this notion that it will take time to tell. I mean, I think it's true of any historical question or presidential record. We won't know where it will sit until we've had a few decades to ruminate on it. I think, though, there's a greater connection between Obama and Trump than you're prepared to admit. And I don't think I'm comfortable shifting the blame entirely to Hillary Clinton's failures, or indeed to the Republicans who didn't see Trump coming. There's something about, and this is that we need several hours to unpack all this. There's something about the Obama presidency that makes Trump viable. And we can claim, well, that's a kind of historical racism. It's a disaffection with metropolitan elites. I mean, there are lots of answers, but I don't think we've yet systematized what those answers are. We've not yet. So I mean, I've studied the continuity across administrations. I am much more struck, John, by the continuities between Trump and Obama. And particularly this notion that there is a savior mentality within American politics that both exploit. That I, Obama, or I, Trump, represent the outsider. That my personality and my life history is the difference. And armed with this, we can revolutionize American politics. the system is very susceptible to that kind of pitch, and both men make it, and they both believe themselves, uniquely themselves, to be transformational, and that's part of the problem that both have. They both end up failing to live up to the expectations of their base. So I'm not saying they're identical political characters, clearly not. Rhetorically quite different, but the claim to power is really unsettlingly similar, and I don't think we've fully assessed that yet.
Well, Tim, let me read something you wrote about Trump, and it will, I'm sure, provoke a good discussion. You say, this is the man, after all, love him or hate him, who has transformed American and possibly even global politics. His ignorance, racism, sexism, duplicity, and narcissism, all documented here, you're talking about some books, have not prevented him from becoming the most consequential leader since the end of the Cold War. Why is a man so chaotic, so reviled, so malignant, also so transformational? And very interesting thought, but I wonder if maybe you're using the word transformational when you mean consequential. I mean, I think all of us would posit he has been a very, very consequential president. To me, transformational has a connotation that's a little bit different, that suggests more constructive, strategic, broad-minded, kind-hearted. To me, and again, I looked at you. You got me looking at a lot of definitions of transformational leadership, but some of the ones I've seen have more of a positive connotation than consequential, disruptive. So play off that.
Yeah, so I share that, and that's very well put. I think that the argument about Trump is that his influence starts and ends with him. So he's central to everything that he does. There's no institutional follow through. So he hasn't transformed American institutions. And I don't think that's what I'm trying to argue there. He's not dissimilar, sorry to digress, I mean, different political characters, but Richard Nixon, and particularly the Nixon-Kissinger axis, and obviously in terms of foreign policy, part of its great skill was how much it depended on the agency of both these men, their covert diplomacy, the opening to China. What they weren't capable of is actually leaving behind any sort of institutional process that would allow this kind of innovation to carry forward. Now, I think there's something I think that's not an unhelpful way of understanding Donald Trump, that Trump's capacity to generate anger and dislocation and rage sufficient to win national political power is entirely dependent on him. There's not even a plan, as far as I can deduce, to pass on power to one of his children. I mean, that's often speculated on. It's very much him. There's not even a Kissinger figure back of this. Any advisor that came close to him was very quickly sidelined because it was stealing the limelight from President Trump. So I think your question about transformation is an extremely good one. So my defense of that claim would be he's transformed what it is, where the legitimacy of political power resides. And I could be wrong. We could return to some sort of status quo ante, but I doubt it. And that transformation is making both parties understand that they have failed to speak to a very large, important lower middle class in the United States, and that it's impossible into the future to imagine any presidential candidate, any national political platform, writing them out of their agenda in the way that we got used to before Donald Trump. Now, you might claim that that's too small a basis to claim a profound transformation, but I think it's a very, very important one. Okay, in terms of foreign policy, transformation, well, he certainly stopped the big wars. He spoke the language of aggression and having a button bigger than Pyongyang's, but was extremely reticent in using American force abroad. And this great liberal world order, of course, became highly susceptible to to military force from Clinton and Obama in Libya, and he stopped that. And I think we can argue definitions, but I think that represents in some way a transformation of American foreign policy. So my defense is going to be your defense here, that we need to wait and see how transformational he's been. I think in terms of electoral politics, his influence has been transformational and will last. And in foreign policy, well, we'll see how quickly Biden is able to roll back some of Trump's innovations. I don't think we'll see a transformation away from Trump when it comes to China policy. I think for all its crudity, I think he's been more effective in his trade war with China, highly imperfect and a long way to run to see how it goes, but in a way that Biden is unlikely to try and jettison quickly.
Well, before we go to Biden, I guess I have to ask you about, the events of January 6th, the assault on the Capitol. And I'm not, I'm not going to ask you to speak for 25 million people residing in Australia, but I'm sure it was playing, on the TV screens. Was there a sense of just stunned quiet, or was it seen as kind of the logical culmination of the Trump presidency?
Yes, it's a very, very good question, and of course I do speak on behalf of 25 million Australians. We started with this discussion with me trying to articulate my notion of political history, and I suppose I'd look at January the 6th in a way that that contextualizes what we saw. So I'm still working through this, but these were a bunch of very weird, crazed individuals that inflicted on the American system a kind of global indignity that it will recover from, but it will take a little while. It seems to me their fundamental clownishness captured in the way they address themselves, but not in a way that I think we should simply dismiss as a kind of absurd rump. And the way I contextualize it is, and I'm not saying they are the modern equivalents of this, but there is a very long history of diverse protest in the United States on behalf of causes today which we would say are both good and bad. I'm thinking the costumes that, I've not seen this written yet, and perhaps there's an op-ed in it, but the Boston Tea Party was about men in colorful costumes initiating the American Revolution. I think the civil rights movement was about protest. The whole Black Lives Matter protests over last summer embodied this tradition of protest. So I'm struggling, but to locate January 6th within this tradition, but I don't think it's impossible to actually make the attempt. I've got some reservations about pulling it off wholesale. And the other thing I'd say about January 6th is it highlights again just how poorly defended. This is the greatest military machine in the history of the world, the most sophisticated intelligence gathering entity mechanism in the history of the world. And it couldn't see this coming, couldn't see 9/11 coming. I mean, what 9/11 exposed was how vulnerable to very simple assault the key institutions of the American government were. And this again played out on January the 6th. Sorry, I'm now leveraging in a crude connection, but I've called American politics the sins of omission. It's the absence of force in much of what it does, the absence of preparation, which is far more marked in its history. I'm thinking of Pearl Harbor, which wasn't preempted, Gulf of Tonkin, which wasn't preempted, the attack on the American embassy in Tehran in 1979, which was not appropriately protected and preempted. And I just wonder whether January 6th again highlights that kind of overly relaxed attitude about the nature of a threat. So that's a two-sided answer, which might suggest I'm still trying to work through some of the consequences. But from my perspective, John, I think the American system is perfectly placed to recover from this, if only because of the absurd nature of the invasion itself. Even though it proved fatal, America is capable of recovering, as it was from 9/11 and from Pearl Harbor.
Well, Tim, in your capacity as a spokesman for 25 million Australians, tell us about what you're expecting from the Biden administration. How do you measure President-elect Biden? What do you think he's going to do? Not many presidents have faced a greater array of challenges on their first day as they walk in.
Yes, well, your connection, both experiential and geographically, is far more grounded in a notion of democratic politics. So I'm very interested to get your response to this. I'd characterize what I expect from Biden in two different ways. The first one is that he will represent, and this is uncomfortable, of course, for his base, that he will represent a significant amount of continuity with the Trump administration when it comes to foreign policy. I don't think, as I've said before, he's going to revolutionize the American approach to China. I think he'll tweak. And I don't think he's going to expend too much political capital trying to reawaken the Iran nuclear deal. I think for cosmetic reasons more than anything, he will try and get Paris moving again and get greater acceptance for it. I mean, not an inconsiderable achievement if he can pull it off. But I don't think these represent revolutions away from Trump. They're much more, I think, a recalibration. And he will talk the language of diplomacy. I don't think we always exaggerate, John, the extent to which the approach of an American president can change fundamentally the national interest calculations in the Kremlin, or in Beijing, or in Paris, or in London, or wherever else. But he will make it seem that diplomacy has reasserted itself. I think that will create problems for him and expectations he won't be able to deliver on. But the alternative prediction is less continuity with Trump and a forlorn attempt to run a third Obama term. That if you looked at the men and women that are filling the administration, many coming through that revolving door of think tanks and universities in a way that Trump was never able to pull off. Some very intelligent people, but these are, again, we're not wishing to indict them because I have to move in several of these circles myself, but these are the men and women that are also complicit in the last 30 years of American foreign policy failure. So if you tell me what the key achievements of the Obama administration were, and I think they are thin, and then say, well, Biden is going to recreate them and move them forward, I would be skeptical that there's enough there to actually make a third Obama term possible. And the only other caveat to that I would add is, and as I get older, I get much more hypersensitive to this observation. But this is now the oldest man ever to hold the position. He wasn't a terrific vice president. We can argue over this. He gets most of the big questions wrong. His legislative, and again, you can argue back, and we can agree to disagree. But the legislative accomplishments across his 50 years in Washington aren't of sufficient magnitude to suggest he will seamlessly be able to implement them. Now he's being given the #1 spot, and of course he is president and leader of a party which we've rather elided the internal divisions of in this desperate race to get rid of Donald Trump. So he's got to navigate a set of internal and external challenges, which I think a man in his declining political years will find very challenging. What do you think, John?
I think he's going to be focused like a laser on COVID. I think his read is that unless he gets COVID under control, everything else is secondary. So I think he's going to focus on COVID response and getting the economy back in place. And I think if he can do those two things, whatever that means, I mean, I think he has a chance to be a very substantial president. I don't see a lot of other policy initiatives. And like you, I think he's going to try to bring, the language of American foreign policy back more into the kind of internationalist camp where it's been for, during the presidencies of Obama and Bush 41 and Clinton. So I think but I think COVID is going to be, I think his read is, and unless the U.S. gets a lot better on COVID, it's going to be uphill climb the whole way.
Yes.
Tim, I have a couple. Tim, we have. I was going to say. Go ahead.
Well, just say yes. I've erred in eliding COVID there. That and in part it might be psychological. I find it difficult to conceive of the disaster that COVID represents for the American people, because I'm sitting in this seemingly immune, not perfectly immune, but mostly immune island. It's very difficult to see that many deaths, which are now beyond the number of people that died in the Second World War, and not to be the single conditioning issue of the Biden term. So I think COVID is the answer to the first, second, and third question posed about American politics in the current moment.
I think I definitely agree. Tim, we actually have some wonderful questions people have emailed in, and I'd like to tee them up for you. The first is from Bill from Chicago, and he wonders just how Australia dealt with the Trump presidency in terms of, the diplomatic protocol, the relationships. I know President Trump, out of the box got into kind of a sparring match with your prime minister, and that was public. How did the Australian government deal with the Trump administration?
That's a good question. Well, I think it dealt with Trump. I'm not saying it dealt with Trump better than any other government, but the advantage Trump had in regards to Australia, and I don't think Trump, except in terms of golf course opportunities, thinks about Australia at all. I think that's generally true of most presidents. Australia just isn't on the radar screen. I think he benefited from having a more populist liberal, which means conservative, in Australia. It's great being in Australia because you can claim to be liberal and actually mean it, because the Liberal Party is the right of centre Conservative Party. But having a more populist prime minister in office in Australia eventually that spoke a language that Trump could understand. But I think there's also the contention that Obama, despite being feted in Canberra, our capital, that Obama had a much more. He was an Atlanticist. He fetishized the European Union. He wanted to turn. I mean, this is a caricature, but like all caricatures, it carries a kernel of truth. He wanted to turn the United States into a European nation. He didn't, despite his Asian background. He spent some of his formative years in Indonesia. He didn't really have an Asian perspective. And Australia has developed a much more nuanced and self-conditioning understanding of itself as an Asian nation. And I'm not saying that Trump facilitated this, but Trump disdained Europe. He saw the action. Indeed, the trade war was with China. He took Asia, and I think his North Korean diplomacy illustrates this. He took Asia more seriously and in a way that Australia understands than is often given credit for. So it doesn't mean there's a great groundswell of support for Trump, but I think I'd make the contention, and I'm sure I can pull up some polling data that might prove this, that there was a sympathy for Trump amongst more people in Australia than would be the case in France or Germany. I think that's how I'd answer that very good question.
Well, Mark from Springfield asks about Springfield, Illinois, our state capital, asks what you think the Biden administration might do with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big trade pact that had been negotiated during the Obama presidency. And then, I mean, it was not moving. And then Trump came in and pulled the U.S. out. How is that pact looked at in Australia? Well, I think that people have sort of moved on and kind of done their own deal, but are they hoping the U.S. will re-enter the agreement?
Yeah, so I think here Trump shot himself in the foot by not understanding, I think, what the central purpose of the TPP was, and that's the containment of China. It's not to forget as well that Hillary Clinton, for reasons of electoral expediency, also says she would have not signed up to TPP. But in its essence, and I read this more as a geostrategist than I do as an economist, the point of the TTP was to build a coalition against Chinese economic power, and Australia is profoundly interested in this objective. And so my suspicion is that Biden will move back towards it because he needs a way of continuing the trade war with China, but one which is more diplomatically acceptable, which generates more consensus amongst this rather nebulous notion of an international community. So my hunch is that he will be more innovative than Trump has been, but with the same objective, and that's about calling China on some of its behavior. And as far as TPP was able to do that, Biden will seek to make America an important part of it. But that's a hunch rather than a clear prediction of how that will turn out.
Stacy from Carbondale asks, how crazy and hypocritical do Americans look to the world? So we'll let you speak for the entire world, not just the 25 million people in Australia.
Well, all human life is in the United States. It's the working out of the human condition. It attracts, and mostly it's full of people that chose to go there to escape the iniquities and inequalities and oppressions of the old world. And we do have an expectation that it's going to be much more quiescent, much more perfect in its march towards progress, forgetting that its genesis is about the escape from the struggles of failed political systems. It's still remarkable to me that a nation with its history of oppression, of some people call it genocide of Native Americans, of the history of slavery and of racial oppression and segregation, should be as healthy a democracy as it actually is. That the outrage that the Trump invaders caused is not indicative of American political failure, but of the strength of the institutions that his supporters desecrated. So I wouldn't be on that bandwagon that seeks to find in every American weakness and failure a refutation of the American experiment itself. It is supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be the working through of the psychoses that cripple other ideological experiments, but which in the United States has actually served it pretty well. And I would still, my final point here, I'd still rather have a system that produces a Donald Trump than a system which produces a Xi Jinping or a Vladimir Putin. Trump is going. He faced 4 years of the most profound, vociferous opposition, institutionally, culturally, on the university campus, in the media, and he will go as per the mandate of the American Constitution. And one can't say the same of Russian politics or of Chinese politics.
Tim, what's next on your horizon in terms of projects? I know you write prolifically. You teach. And do you have another book in the works, or what are you thinking in that respect?
Well, I do, and I will look forward to very much in 20 years' time when I finished it, doing this again with you. No, I've got 2 manuscripts in development. One is tentatively titled The Trump Ultimatum. And the contention of the shortish book, I'm looking for about 40,000 words, the contention is that Trump represents the best opportunity American politics has to reform itself. That if Trump becomes the reason for both parties to dig in and to increase polarization, the whole Trump experience will have been wasted. So it can't get worse, it can only get better. I mean, it's a very hopeful narrative, argument, but one that hasn't yet been invalidated. That's the short project I'm working on. The longer project is a history of US decline, or importantly, some of the reasons that have always stood against decline, some of the inherent and innate strengths America has, mapped across history. Things like, as we mentioned in our conversation earlier, things like religiosity, things like a healthy nationalism, the fact that America is an immigrant nation, and has a remarkable hard military power capacity. I'm measuring what at the moment I've got 10 reasons to doubt American decline, which I'm observing across the span of US history as a bigger research project.
Well, Tim, finally, when you're not working on wonderful books and writing, how do you relax and unwind? I know you're married to a Texan, so I'm sure she keeps you on your toes. But tell me about how you relax.
You know, that's a very good question. Brian Lamb, who's one of my favorite interviewers, who ran C-SPAN for a number of, created C-SPAN, he would always ask this question about hinterlands. What does a writer do when they're not writing? It's a difficult question to answer. I'm from Leicestershire in England, it's where I'm native to. I have an 18-year-old son who's going off to university. That might be part of the answer, that I've been a father to a child for the last couple of decades. That's been my hinterland, but particularly Leicester City Football Club, who pulled off the most remarkable victory in sporting history by winning the English Premier League in 2015-16. That's what I do to relax. So it's a measure of the esteem in which I hold you, John, and the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. I have at half time this morning broken away from watching Leicester City play Chelsea to come and speak to you. So that's what I do. I watch Leicester City Football Club. I raise my son, or try and pretend that I'm raising him. I also love cricket, which is a very superior version, a sophisticated version of baseball. And that's a great consumer of time and a brilliant way to relax. And Australia delivers that in abundance.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. It's been delightful to visit you via Zoom. I look forward to us getting together either in Southern Illinois when you're on a book tour, or when my wife and I are back in Australia. But we really have, it's been a delight to talk to you, and some really interesting, fresh perspectives on a really interesting time in American life. So thank you so much, and let's stay in touch.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure, and it's wonderful to be able to talk to the good people connected to the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. It's a place I would love to come and visit, and to visit with you, and I look forward to doing that very soon when COVID has been solved.
We look forward to having you, Tim. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We will have this interview on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Please view it and pass it on to your friends. Thanks for supporting the Institute. Your support helps us keep the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.